historic conflicts.
Europe in the early 20th century stood at a crossroads of hope and tension. The cities of Paris, Vienna, London, and Berlin thrived with culture and innovation, while the countryside bustled with industry and life. Yet beneath the surface, old rivalries simmered, and the continent was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The causes of World War I are as tangled as the alliances that bound Europe together. Nationalism surged in every corner. The French still nursed wounds from their defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. Serbs, Poles, Czechs, and other peoples yearned for their own nations, chafing under the rule of foreign empires. In every capital, pride and suspicion grew side by side. Imperialism added fuel to the fire. The great powers of Europe competed for colonies and influence across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Each new acquisition, each border drawn, heightened the tension. The world's resources, it seemed, were not enough for all. But perhaps the most dangerous force was the alliance system itself. By the early 1900s, Europe was divided into two armed camps. On one side stood the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Britain. On the other, the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. Each alliance promised mutual defense, turning any conflict into a potential continent-wide catastrophe. Militarism crept into every aspect of life. Armies swelled, navies expanded, and generals drew up plans for wars they hoped would never come. The notion that military might ensure peace gripped leaders and citizens alike. Railways were laid not just for commerce, but for mobilizing armies. In every capital, war was discussed as a tool of policy rather than a last resort. Then, on June 28, 1914 in Sarajevo, the first shot was fired not from a cannon, but from a pistol. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated by Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb nationalist. What might have remained a local crisis set off a chain reaction. Austria-Hungary, seeking to assert its power, delivered an ultimatum to Serbia. Serbia refused. Russia, bound to Serbia by Slavic kinship and alliance, mobilized. Germany declared war on Russia. France honored its treaty with Russia. Germany invaded Belgium to outflank France, bringing Britain into the war. Within weeks, Europe was engulfed in flames. The war that followed was unlike any before. By late 1914, armies had dug themselves into the earth, stretching lines of trenches from the North Sea to Switzerland. The Western Front became a landscape of mud, barbed wire, and shattered trees. Men lived, fought, and died in the trenches, enduring shell fire, rats, and disease. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 became a symbol of futility. On the first day alone, nearly 60,000 British soldiers fell, many never to rise again. Verdun, that ancient fortress city, was battered for 10 months. Over 300,000 men died, and the land was left scarred and barren. Yet the war was not confined to Europe alone. Battles raged in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Colonial soldiers from India, Africa, Australia, and Canada fought and died far from home. The Atlantic became a battleground as German U-boats hunted Allied ships. The conflict became truly global, pulling in the United States in 1917 after years of neutrality and the sinking of civilian ships like the Lusitania. Technology changed the face of war. Machine guns swept fields clean of advancing soldiers. Artillery shells shattered men and earth alike. Tanks, lumbering and unreliable, made their first appearance. Airplanes soared above the trenches, first as scouts, then as fighters and bombers. Poison gas, chlorine, phosgene, and mustard crept silently across no man's land, burning lungs and blinding eyes. The war became a laboratory for destruction. Through it all, strategies adapted, but the killing did not stop. Generals ordered attack after attack, often gaining only a few yards at terrible cost. Soldiers wrote letters home, describing horrors they could scarcely believe. Civilians faced hunger, air raids, and the anxiety of loved ones lost. By 1918, exhaustion gripped all sides. The Russian Empire, racked by revolution, withdrew from the war, signing a harsh peace with Germany. In the West, the arrival of fresh American troops tipped the balance. Germany launched one final offensive in the spring, hoping for victory before American strength could be brought to bear. It failed. The Allies counterattacked, pushing the exhausted German army back. On November 11, 1918, the guns finally fell silent. The toll was staggering. Over 17 million people, soldiers and civilians alike, had perished. Millions more were wounded, many bearing scars for life. Entire landscapes were obliterated, villages vanished, and cities lay in ruins. A generation of young men, often called the Lost Generation, was decimated, their futures sacrificed on the altar of war. But the war's end was not a simple return to peace. The old empires collapsed under the strain. The German Kaiser fled into exile, and the German Empire became a republic. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, once a patchwork of nations, dissolved into new, fragile states. The Ottoman Empire disintegrated, its lands divided by the victorious powers. Russia, gripped by communist revolution and civil war, withdrew from the world stage, its Tsar and his family murdered. Europe was left traumatized, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. The war had promised to be short and glorious. Instead, it was long, bitter, and senseless. The survivors returned home changed forever. Some found only empty houses and shattered communities. Others suffered from what would later be called shell shock, the psychological wounds of relentless violence and loss. As diplomats gathered in Paris in 1919, hope mingled with bitterness. The Treaty of Versailles was meant to secure a lasting peace, but it sowed the seeds of future conflict. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, a humiliation that stung deeply. Crushing reparations were imposed, crippling the German economy and fueling resentment. The map of Europe was redrawn, creating new states and new tensions. The dream of self-determination for all peoples was only partly fulfilled, leaving minorities stranded and dissatisfied. Darkness lingered over the continent. In the defeated nations, anger and despair simmered. In Germany, economic collapse and political chaos paved the way for extremists, most notably Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. Across Europe, faith in progress and civilization was shaken. The League of Nations, created to preserve peace, proved powerless to enforce its will. World War I did not end war. Instead, it began a century of blood. The unresolved grievances, the humiliation of nations, and the trauma of millions created fertile ground for the rise of fascism, totalitarianism, and a new, even more devastating conflict: World War II. The horrors of the trenches echoed in the camps and battlefields of the next war, when technology and hatred combined on an even greater scale. The legacy of World War I is not just found in the fallen empires or the redrawn borders, but in the shattered psyche of a world that lost its innocence. Poets and artists captured the pain, bitterness, and futility of the conflict. Memorials and graves spread across Europe, silent witnesses to the price of pride and folly. If we seek to understand the 20th century, the rise and fall of nations, the agony of global war, the hopes for peace in the depths of despair, we must begin with the war that started it all. World War I was not merely a conflict of armies, but a crucible that reshaped the modern world. To understand the 20th century, you must understand the war that started it all. Thank you for respecting history. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and write the bell so you don't miss any battles.